you were just lamenting how hard it is for you to find a job, but you've been doing cybersecurity for the Navy? Like,
I'm John Kugelman. So I live outside of the Washington, D.C. area. I've been a software developer for my whole life, but working for 16 years for a defense contractor out here. I've been at the same company the whole time. And well, up until recently, it took a sabbatical due to COVID, but up until recently, I was at the same company. So I feel like that's a kind of a unique thing in
it
the
really is.
industry.
Yeah, no, people in tech in general move around a lot. So the first question I always actually like to ask, what's your first memory with technology altogether?
Okay,
So
yeah.
as young as you can remember.
As young as I can remember, I've listened to a few of your episodes, so I knew this was coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as far back as I can remember was probably I was 5 or 6 years old. My parents got like a PC Junior, which was, like an IBM flagship computer that really didn't do well, actually, it turns out. But so I just played games back then. And I remember it stuck out because the game they would let me play that I tried to play was Leisure Suit Larry, which is totally inappropriate. Now I
At
see this.
5 years old.
Yeah, they didn't have any idea, I don't think. And it should have been a warning sign that when you play the game, there's like an age gate and it asks you like, who is President Nixon's vice president? You can't play this game unless you can answer that question. So I was just like, I had no idea. Luckily, I also, being just a very little kid, I couldn't get very far in the game, and I got blocked at a point very early in the game where you have to type in, you're knocking on the secret door to enter a bar, and they're like, "What's the password?" And the password was "Ken sent me," but you had about 60 seconds to type it, and I couldn't manage to type it.
There's
within
no way
60
to get
seconds.
past that as a 5-year-old.
That's as far as I could get.
So that was probably in the days of 16 color screens, right? So we're talking EVGA
Yes.
or something.
That was
Okay.
pre-VGA even, yes.
5 or 6, then you start school. What were your first educational experiences with it? How did you start moving into maybe programming?
Right. Obviously, fast forward quite a bit. But yeah, I got into, well, the first, I guess when Doom came out, that was a huge deal for me. That was when I was 12 years old, I think, like 94. So I was playing that and eventually started making levels in there. And that was my foray into not just playing games, but like I started, making levels and realizing that, hey, back then they didn't have scripting, but you could do a little bit of exe manipulation. And the whole thing was very interesting to me. And I remember there was a point, like maybe the thing that sparked programming, I don't remember exactly, but there was a point where you would make a level and you have a graphical editor, you design the whole thing. And then you had to sort of compile your level, like process it before you could run it. And so I remember they had a program called like BSP, the binary space partition. id Software, you had to run their program and it would do something. At 12 years old, I had no idea what it was doing exactly, but you had to run it or else your level didn't work. But I was really curious, as I am to this day. I always wanted to know what's going on and what that meant. And it just kind of blew my mind. I got the source code. I didn't know what source code was, but I remember getting this, like the C source code, opening the thing up to try to see what is this thing doing? And I couldn't wrap my head around, like, you had this text code all over my screen. I'm on a DOS prompt. It was just a bunch of code. And I was like, I couldn't connect how this text code could do graphics. And geometry. And I just sat there kind of stunned for a while trying to like decipher this. And I was like, I'm not moving my mouse. There's no lines on the screen. I don't understand what's going on. But that was really interesting to me. So yeah, I started doing basic programming, like GW basic. I got really interested in C. C++ was like almost a brand new thing then, not quite brand new, but it wasn't. It was still catching on. So
was this, you started buying books? You had no instructor or teacher or anything?
Exactly. There was no internet. The internet came along, there was bulletin board systems, but you couldn't get programming help on those things. We'd play games. But yeah, I would go to Micro Center, to the bookstore, and just like sit there and just devour their books, and then pester my mom to go buy these. I remember getting C for Dummies, and I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever read. I just devoured that book. I remember that, like, it was a 2-volume thing. So I get to the end of the book, but they're only halfway there. And I'm like, oh God, where's volume 2? And I had to wait. And actually turned out it took a couple of years. And then by the time volume 2 came out, I was picked it up, but it was almost nostalgia, because at that point I was a couple of years later, I knew it all. And I was like, oh, never
Yeah, I
mind.
don't need this now.
I don't need
I mean, for people who are younger than us, the programming books were 2 hands wide. Like we're talking 1,200 pages each, just these massive books
Oh
that
yeah, it
were,
was awesome.
yeah, it was
Because as a
like 2 copies of
teenager,
the Lord of the Rings side by side. They're
now I
just,
can't handle that amount of information, but
yeah,
then I would just, absorb it
complete,
all.
yeah, completely all in.
Yeah.
So, was there any programming in high school at all,
Oh,
or
absolutely. So
yeah,
I was even pre-high school. I remember, like I said, at this point, I'm 13, 14 years old. I was learning how to program, and from the very beginning, I loved answering questions. And so I found, like, now, I guess a big thing I do is I'm on Stack Overflow and I answer a lot of questions, and I'm like one of the top users on there. Back then, I had the bug from the very beginning, and I went on 2 places. I remember going on America Online, running up the phone bill, answering programming questions on there, and my parents were mad/proud.
yeah,
And then I also was on Usenet, which doesn't really exist anymore. And if anybody, if people around back then, it was basically the forums that we had back then where you could, post questions and discussions. But it was really wild, wild west. I mean, if people are rude now, people were unbelievably rude back then.
right,
And I was
okay,
one of them. I was just a teenager, so I had not, softened up and polished those rough edges off. So
yeah.
I was definitely, I'd like
So,
to answer questions, but I had an attitude.
right. So for people who don't know, do you know what your Stack Overflow score is right now? Because I think I looked this up, but
Yeah, it's 300,000 something.
300,000. And I think I'm in the top 5% at like 16,000. Like it's mind blowing how many, you're doing a lot of good work for a lot of people right there.
Thanks.
That's,
I have, yeah, from the very beginning, when it came out, right? Before that, there were just experts. I got to say this correctly, Experts Exchange.
yeah.
Don't want to say that one wrong.
Yeah. 3 times fast.
It was just terrible. There was not a great way to get answers to questions online. And so Stack Overflow came out, and when I saw, I was there from the beginning because it just resonated with me. I was like, this is what we need. We need a way to answer questions, have people ask things, and then have it curated really well.
Yeah.
And the whole gamification system that they have, where you get points and badges and all this kind of stuff, I think that works wonders. I think a lot of the longtime users will talk out of the sides of their mouths and be like, oh, the points don't matter. But it does. It makes it fun.
They do.
So, like, they don't matter. I don't go there for that, but it's fun. It just makes it a little fun,
Yeah.
That's a whole thing we could always, that's a Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
Is a whole.
Yeah. We can talk more about that later. Now you're answering on Usenet. You're doing a little bit in school. Did you know right away that this was for you in university, or did you play around with some other ideas?
I knew from the very beginning. I had 2 things. I was also really into music. You can see some of that behind me. I had, and I was really into programming, and those were my 2 passions from since I was young, and it was very easy because I was like, hey, there's one of these can be my career, one can be my hobby. And it just made sense. I was like, well, let me do as a career the one that pays really well. Let me definitely make the other one the hobby. Yeah, I mean, so that was crystal clear. And I didn't actually realize when I was younger that it doesn't work that way for most people. Most people don't know what they want to do, and you figure it out as you get older. Maybe, and some people won't even figure it out. But I didn't know that. I just thought, oh, to me, I knew exactly what I was going to. Math and science and programming just clicked. Like, they just made sense. Yeah, when I was in high school, I taught everything to myself. I learned everything outside of school, really. I remember sitting in math class, and I had my TI 83 calculator, and I eventually, they had like a little programming language in there, so I'd write stuff in there. But then eventually I found out you could write assembly code for that thing, and so I was writing assembly code, and I was like, oh, this is so much faster, and it's amazing. It was a really cool way to like learn computing that I think is starting from this like ground level of assembly and C,
Yeah.
that I'm thankful for, because I think if I started nowadays learning, that's not where people start learning.
A lot of people from who I've spoken to so far, it's basic. There's the old 20 go to 10,
Yeah,
and you get that eternally repeating hello world and stuff. But you went straight in on the assembly side really early, like
that's
uh, yeah,
that's what they had then. Yeah, it
yeah,
was just yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And so from high school, there probably weren't any major mentors or anything. It was still scraping around and getting your own thing. When we move in, did you have any major epiphanies that came out of that time?
oh, interesting. I don't know. That was a whole just everything was learning, and I was building lots of opinions about everything. I remember I was really into programming language design, even like in the high school time. I got really fascinated by like what makes a good programming language, and I had sketching out like my own thoughts on like what I thought the ideal programming language would be, and this preceded Unicode. But it turns out what I really wanted was lots more symbols to work with and make it look much more natural. Like, so much later Python came along, or I discovered Python, because I guess it was probably there at that time. But when I discovered Python, I was like, this is very close to what I was thinking. Get
Right.
rid of a lot of the symbols, make it nice and readable.
Yeah.
And I was always, so the ergonomics of programming I've always been interested in, because I think like the idioms that are possible and that you can that like the languages shape our thoughts. And I guess there's like there's a hypothesis that people have that like natural language does the same thing. I don't know if that's true, but I do think programming languages definitely influence what ideas you can come up with and what you can express when you're writing code. So I liked when I discovered functional programming. That was sort of a very interesting thing. That's like a university thing. I didn't actually get taught that at university, but it just at that time I started hearing about that. And
Can you explain to us and me, I mean, me specifically, what is functional programming? How does it differ from object oriented or any other type?
sure. Yeah, so functional programming is like you take a different, so I guess traditional programming that most of us are used to that you do in JavaScript or Python or C is like procedural. And you have a series of statements and they do things, they have side effects. You have variables, you set their values, you increment them, you print things to the screen, um, you know, and you sort of follow it top to bottom. Um, and even if you're object oriented, that's still procedural style programming. And some of this has started catching on. This functional idea it can blend in there nicely, but it's like, hey, instead of necessarily having all these side effects, what if you think it in a sort of pure math terms? And in pure math, like if you go back to like algebra, you have a function that has inputs and it has outputs. And if you apply this idea to programming, that if I make sure that my functions always declare everything they depend on as input. And then instead of doing things and changing the state of the system, like printing something to the screen, they have to return everything that they do. That is like, you build off of this idea of pure functions. You can see exactly their inputs and outputs. They don't have side effects. You can it allows like a different kind of reasoning about your program. Something that these days has caught on a lot is immutability.
Right.
That by restricting ourselves and having objects that we decide not to change their fields, it actually makes some things a lot easier, because you just don't have to worry about somebody changing your data while you're working on it. It's like another thread. So
Right.
there's like, hey, if you impose these restrictions on yourself and think this way, multi-threading becomes a lot easier. The functional programming was all just like, yeah, if you know your inputs and outputs, you can maybe apply some crazy algorithm and reasoning and abstract thought about this, that you can see exactly what's going on. But anyways, so there's whole programming languages that are written kind of in this pure way, where they're functional, but the thing is they're so foreign feeling. Their syntax
Yeah.
is so weird, like Lisp. It's just tons of parentheses and it just looks nothing like C or anything that I think that stuff was too foreign to ever catch on,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So
Um,
that's something to be said about ergonomics.
that's one of the things that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. And I have a friend from another interview who is really into functional programming, and I'm still trying to nail that down in a really nice and clear way. That was helpful.
So real quick, like
Yeah.
I think like that, I myself didn't actually work in those language, like learn Lisp or Scheme or whatever. But I think like these days it became it. They figured out how to integrate the stuff into the languages that we know, like C# and Java. You know, they and Python. They have sort of added functional idioms where you can, you know, and I think in all these languages you can take a list and you can map it, and it, you know, give me this values, turn it into these values, and then you can filter them. And these are all functional idioms. And I think it's really nice how they blend into the code that we already use.
Wonderful. Yes. Okay. Um, so we are still so I guess that was the sort of things that you discovered in the high school phase. And now let's move into the university phase. And what did you pick up in that space in terms of what was it like learning in university, and what are the major takeaways you got from that time?
Yeah, this this might sound crazy, but so a couple things. One, I didn't learn that much in university actually, which probably sounds weird, but I had just been so fascinated and taught myself all this stuff that I felt like I was a little bit ahead. Like I was always in the math, and so like I learned about big O notation and algorithm analysis like on my own. So then when I got to college, I was like, oh, this is really familiar territory. But I will say that like I know that's a huge contentious thing, or it's a that's something that most of us, if you do a CS degree, they focus really a lot on theoretical concepts and mathematical stuff like big O notation. And I know it's super controversial, or you know, everybody has, you know, the common thing is, oh man, I learned the stuff at university and then I have to refresh myself 15 years later when I'm interviewing for and do leak code problems, and like this, where's the connection to what I do day to day, because I don't use this stuff day to day. And I think that's a pretty interesting disconnect there. So because I love math, I love that theoretical side of everything, but I've always been conflicted because I have no arguments when people say this is not that practical, and I'm like, yeah, kind of
It,
isn't. It's like nice to know, and I'm glad I know it, but also you don't normally design algorithms. It's like that's 1% of what we do.
yeah, I think one of the strongest arguments I've seen recently for the value of big O notation was put on. There was a Google talk about the next billion users, and the next billion users are coming from India, and they're coming from below the poverty line in America, and they're coming into our world of connected internet stuff on devices like the Nokia 2, or something that's a very underpowered device overall. And so if we can write efficient algorithms, we can give them a top tier experience on those slow devices. And so if we are working in the realm of thinking about big O, then that improves accessibility across the globe. So there is a bit of an argument in favor of big O everywhere, in terms of granting accessibility to that next level, that next, as I say, the next billion users are the ones who are going to come on for that. But
Yeah, you're
certainly,
right. Like
yeah,
working on performance, you know, you can get by with super powerful hardware and not necessarily have to think about it. But there's always there's other people in other countries that don't have that powerful hardware, or like you say, there's just now your thing is not just bound to PCs, it can work on mobile devices. Or if your stuff is good enough for mobile devices, maybe you can get it ported over to embedded devices with even less horsepower, you know, get your thing running on a Raspberry Pi or whatever processor. I really liked you. I think you were talking to Jeff Wong in a previous episode,
yep,
and I think you guys had a really good discussion about just knowing, like, you don't day to day do big O analysis. Like I do think that way, but I don't, like, you don't just crunch the numbers or like do proofs and stuff, but it's really good as a habit builder to
Yes.
you just build up these like intuitions about, like, that's what you guys are saying. And I really agreed. Like, you build up these intuitions about, oh, I've nested loops. They're probably slow. I probably shouldn't use nested loops, but like, I think, an interesting intuition that people get wrong until they learn this stuff is like having 2 loops or 3 loops, one after the other, is actually okay, big O
Right.
wise. So it's a huge difference between they're sequential or they're nested, but
Yes.
it's not obvious until you learn this kind of stuff. And that's the kind
That's
of lessons I think everyone can benefit from.
Yeah, and so there is some good stuff that comes from that for sure. Oh, and of course, if you are programming from the age of 12 and really committed and on C++ and everything all through the university is, I imagine maybe in year 3 and 4 something comes along, but if you're
The math classes were incredible. And like learning like linear algebra, discrete math, those were great. I'm underselling it. I mean, I did learn a lot.
yeah,
I want to, yeah. And so the thing, I took away from that was just also, I wish universities taught more software engineering practices, more practical stuff too, like how to write good code. And I felt like that was a sort of deficiency in the curriculum, that affects us all. So, that was one of my takeaways from going to college, was seeing what they did and didn't teach. So then I know, okay, when I'm working with people, here's the things that everyone else is not going to have been taught. So maybe we need to teach these things on the job.
the feeling of coming in and working in a code production environment versus the stuff you come out, oh, I just tap this one person program. That's why the co-op programs are so popular and they turn out okay. So let's then talk about how you got to your first job at the end of university. Then was it straight away, or did you bum around a little, or
Yeah, so my first and only job,
yeah.
actually. Uh, so I interned. So it was actually the classic networking. My mom's an engineer, um, and so she, got me in with a local company around where I live, and I interned with them for three summers, and it was fantastic, and I loved it. Um, so yeah, that was another thing where it felt like college, where I didn't know the expectations were, like, I tried harder than I think it turns out like interns have to do. So anyways, they gave us, I was working with a couple interns, and they said, hey, can you work on, now I know that they had no expectations for intern work necessarily, but they're like, hey, can you just make us some internet tool that we need? And I was like, okay, absolutely. And I built out this whole internet and then website, and tooling for them. And I was like, that was my first experience being where they were like, where I had to just go, okay, I don't know how to do web programming, but absolutely, I will just learn this. I will learn PHP because that was the thing at the time. That was like the most popular web framework or language, I guess. There weren't actually a lot of frameworks around. The web world was still new. So yeah, I learned all the ins and outs of web programming, which was just great. I loved it because I had done none of that at college. And the web, this is like the early 2000s. So the web was obviously around. We had the .com boom. So the web was popular, but it was still pretty, relative to now, really in its infancy. Web browser compatibility was just a horrible nightmare. More back then, we just had like these, like, I just remember Internet Explorer was just the absolute worst to work with. So like, of course, these are still problems today, which is funny.
Yeah.
It's just
I mean,
thankfully that specific browser.
for context, this was before Facebook was even released, right?
Oh
So it
yeah,
really
Facebook came
was,
around while I was in
yeah,
college.
it
Yeah,
was a
just
it was a completely different time for the internet. So
no Twitter.
no no Twitter yet. So what sorts of things um, are you learning, or what strong opinions came out of your early web work, if any?
Yeah. PHP was a really fascinating one. It was a really good ground to develop a lot of opinions because I definitely could see the writing on the wall was, hey, PHP is very practical and useful, but nobody really had a very good opinion of it. Um, it really improved over the years since then. It barely had object-oriented anything at that point. It was rife with security bugs and um, like the namings of things of all their libraries were completely inconsistent. Camel case underscore this. It was obviously a very hodgepodge language, but it was incredibly practical. Like one thing I've learned is, you can't undervalue, don't overvalue the theoretical purity of something, and don't undervalue like the fact that lots and lots of people use this. There's lots and lots of libraries, lots of people online are talking about it, and that makes it valuable that you can go out there and get help on this thing, and you can read lots of comments about it, and you can find libraries that do the things you need.
Yeah.
You don't get that necessarily in a really, really nice but esoteric environment.
Right.
Um,
That's an excellent point. I've worked in places where we have internal tools for the frameworks that we use. So like a CMS platform, or a blogging platform. And the problem is, because it's an internal tool, you can't go on to Stack Overflow and say, tell me, when you're trying to work, how do I fix this problem in this internal tool? There's nobody in the world who works on it except for the 10 other engineers that you work with. And here's the other thing about working in a proprietary or a really pure fancy framework. Um, you can you can spend all the time, as long as you're working on that, the added value to your resume is zero,
yeah,
right? Because no, like, you can write Django on your resume, 10 years in Django, and people will reach out to you and say, oh, I need somebody who works in Django. But they're not searching for you on, you know, proprietary one company
right.
framework. And so um, that you're right. The people talking about it is good because it helps you develop faster. But additionally, it's good for your career because it builds out a recognized piece of your
Yeah,
portfolio. Yeah.
absolutely. I think
Yeah.
that's a big danger a lot of people get into is, yeah, the things that you get good at are not marketable. And so that's great as long as you love your job. But then how do you change jobs? How do you change industries? I'm even hitting that. So I've worked in defense my whole life. Um, it's hard to necessarily parlay that into like I've really struggled with how do I get into cloud development or iPhone app development or something. Like it's a hard sell when to tell people that I don't know this stuff now. I can definitely learn it. It won't be that hard to learn, but they're really interested. You don't know it, so
Yeah.
um,
They
yeah,
want people who can hit the ground running and bring these skills in, right? So that and what is the solution for you, for example, if you want to be a distributed systems engineer, what's the solution? Do you have to build a distributed system on your own? And how can you justify it? Because where do you get the scale of the data that requires a distributed system to begin with?
that's a
It's
great question to which I have no answer, and I would love to know the answer to
you
that one.
you want I think we both need to know. I mean, because I see this stuff going on too. I say, wow, Kubernetes is the coolest thing, right? You have this, you know, if my server goes down, Kubernetes just starts it up again. If I start getting massive traffic, it'll split and you have to design your architecture so it works this way, but it'll split my application across
Hmm.
multiple things, and everything is just cool. But where do I get the scale to justify that work? And
Exactly.
that's
Yes.
you've
With Kubernetes
Some
specifically, I've struggled with what I really want to learn it. I would love to have an existing cluster out there that I could just use. And so I don't have to spend my first 100 hours learning Kubernetes on setting up Kubernetes.
right.
I'm like, can I just hit the ground? If I was at a company that did that, I could jump in and play around with it before I had to like learn the ins and outs of all the nightmarish administration, from what I understand of,
Yeah.
administering Kubernetes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a perfect
And
example of
how
how
do
do you
you
learn that.
I, and how do you write the business case for doing this thing when it's, I kind of really just want to do whiz bang stuff, and you're trying to justify that on the business case internally? Anyways,
Yeah.
so you do this internal stuff. You do this internal stuff. You're a software engineer. You're doing a few years of internship. Um, how does it progress from there? They're obviously happy with you. You've been there 14 years. How does the promotion talks start? Do you tell me
Sure.
about
So
how this
so I
goes?
interned there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that went really well. And so then yeah, they offered me a job before I left school. So easy. I took the job, and so I leave school and boom, I have a job waiting for me. And so I started working there, and um so one of the first projects I worked on was, which was really interesting. So I like how I've really, so this wasn't a deliberate strategy, but over the years, I have just dabbled in so many things because I find almost everything interesting to work on. I feel like, thankfully, I have done that because that keeps a variety of skills somewhat sharp, or at least. And so one of the things I did early on that, was I worked on another web project, which this was I thought was really cool, and it was sad that it didn't take off. But it was basically, we had the idea of what turned out to be a precursor, or like when Angular came along.
Yeah.
I sort of saw this and I was like, oh my God, that's the thing that we were trying to make 10 years ago. So the short of it is, back then, the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, they're the guys that standardized HTML and XML, and they're the big standards body out, or one of the big standards bodies out there. So they, I think, mistakenly also tried to create several technologies and several standards, and that is not. That's a whole rant I get into, but standards bodies are really ideal for codifying existing practices. They're not the best at creating something new. So, but something they tried to create was called X forms. And it's basically what I think of as Angular today. It's, they said, okay, XML is the cool thing. Then JSON didn't exist. So they're like, but let's do XML. We'll have, let's load a page up, and you should have XML data in like sort of, your data model should be all XML based. And then when you have your input boxes and select boxes, we're going to make a way that you can tie that into your XML data model, and they will update each other in both directions. And it was this cool idea of binding things together, so you don't have to just have a mess of event listeners in all directions, right, and doing all kinds of manual updating of things. You just, if I go and change the XML data, it'll just whoop, the whole page will get relayed out, and it'll do the whole, like, maybe I have a table that's drawn from there.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
In some ways, is that almost an example of not of functional programming itself, but of the mindset of functional programming?
Yes.
Right? Because you've got your data is just an object floating in memory, and your front end is that sort of functional piece where I can't remember the words you used to say, but it's like, it's static in the center, and it's immutable, and
yes,
they change
exactly
each
that.
other. So it really is that, that's and just like you were saying, that's how these object-oriented languages are pulling functional programming into them.
Exactly.
By using
you
the
don't
paradigms.
have to have explicit, when I update this, then I'm going to go update this text box over here. I'm going to disable this radio button. You don't have to explicitly have sequences of actions. Yes, you just say, this thing should always be disabled based on some condition, and it just figures out
the value is
right.
right.
And it just figures out for you and does all this work of, it under the covers, it's all procedural, really. Ultimately the computer has to execute a sequence of steps, but it can hide that from you, and you don't have to. You can just in our heads, we can just think at a higher level of abstraction, and it's simpler to just think about that way. And that's what I think that the great value of Angular and React and all these new frameworks is making that popular. Of, hey, raw HTML and JavaScript, they're a little bit too low level. You have to manage all these, you have to manage all these listeners and stuff. You also have to manage all this asynchronous callbacks, and it's, man, let's give you another way to think about this. We'll try to simplify this for you.
Right.
So yeah, the W3C was trying to do this. I think they were kind of ahead of the curve. If they could see into the future, they should have just waited until somebody else came along and made this, and they could say, oh, we'll put our stamp of approval on this. That's the way to do it.
Right.
But yeah, but I thought when we did it back then, I had this whole idea. When I came in, this thing existed, and but the way it worked was, it was not JavaScript at all. We had like an entirely back-end server-side system that would read in. It's equivalent of if you took an Angular page now, but if you just fed it through a server-side process, and it spits out some static HTML and JavaScript to do all this stuff. And I had this idea when I came on. I was like, no, this would be so much better if we just did it all in the browser. You load the page, and I just look through the page and find all these controls you scattered throughout the page, and I replace them with HTML ones, and I add event listeners for you and do all this stuff. And it was really fun, because that was, I think, a really novel idea at that time. But it was really hard to do for various technical reasons. Internet Explorer was just like the worst. It was frustrating. It was like, oh, Firefox is out there. Oh, I can do these cool things in Firefox, but Internet Explorer just can't do anything cool. So like a big thing they were missing in that time was when Internet Explorer would load the page up, if it had tags and elements that it didn't recognize, it would just mangle them and destroy them and delete them. So you couldn't do like what Angular React does now and just like trawl through the page and just find their special tags and replace them. Oh, it just mangled it completely. So I had to find ridiculous workarounds for those kinds of problems. So I think also the idea was, that it was also not quite the right time to do that kind of thing. We had the workarounds were just, web browsers probably, I would just declare not capable of that stuff at that point. But it was fun to see that stuff come along. So anyways, that was my journey in web development. And I've been sad to this day that I haven't done web development since then. And now I was like, man, at that time I felt like I was really like expert level. Like I was on the W3C. That was so cool. As a guy right out of college, I thought that was the coolest thing. I'm like, I'm on the standards body. That's like the body. And now I'm like, I can say that, but my knowledge is not useful anymore. The web world moves so fast.
Yeah. So you were actually a member of the standards body?
Yeah. We were our company.
Oh, the company.
The company was, and I was one of the, I would call into those meetings regularly. I thought that was just a really cool peek into the world of the big boys, basically.
Right.
I was like, wow, there's Google in here and Intel and whoever's out, in those committees. And
when was this? Because I see from your resume here that you moved into a role of chief architect, right? And so at what point did we cross over into?
Okay, so that was like the first year or two of right out of school, and after that is when I really so I say I work at a defense contractor, and this was what the project I described was not defense related at all. So it was just a side thing that we were trying to dabble in commercial work. Then I got into really heavy defense work, which is what I've done for the last 15 years. Basically worked on cybersecurity stuff for the Navy. So everything that's cybersecurity related on submarines. We developed all kinds of software and stuff.
Can I interrupt for just a second? So you're sitting around, you were just lamenting how hard it is for you to find a job, but you've been doing cybersecurity for the Navy? Like Are you sure there isn't this line of people standing outside your door
Oh,
waiting to hire
there
you?
absolutely is a line of people.
Yeah.
The problem for them and for me is that I'm like, no, I've had my taste of cybersecurity. Now
Okay.
I want something
Okay.
completely different.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
no recruiter I've talked to, they don't know what to say when I'm like, look at my resume, and then I want to do something that's completely different from what's on my resume.
That's not anywhere on here.
It's
Okay.
just,
So
you see mouths
yeah.
gape.
Yeah. Let's okay, we could get back to it, but I just why in the world would you have a problem finding anything? That's okay.
Yeah. Like I said, I like learning lots of stuff, and so I was, uh, I didn't get into the cybersecurity stuff is what we happened to work on. I was not fundamentally interested in that stuff.
Okay.
I like anything that's just complicated and puzzly, gives you lots of things to work on. Any engineering problem is fascinating to me. So I was like, yeah, I think I have a good handle on this, and yeah, I would love to try something else. But yes, there have been cybersecurity recruiters, messaging me for years. I'm like, well, that's great, but it's not.
Been there, done that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. At that time, at this time, doing the cybersecurity and chief architect is a really big sounding title. Was that how was that for you? What was the scope of that work?
So that is something I grew into over, a 10 plus year period. Um, and it's kind of, so the company doesn't actually do titles really. So this is a title I've given myself because I feel like that's what I was doing. And I have to put on my resume and try to describe what I'm doing. Yeah. So over 10 years, we started out with a small team, and we every year we just added on huge new capabilities. And so after working on this thing for 10 years, I was like, we have a really big system with lots and lots of features and functions, and it just we were trying to basically solve every cybersecurity problem out there, which is a lot of them. As much as they could pay us for, and much as we had employees to work on, we were trying to do take care of everything. That was kind of our underlying mission, was do all that so other people didn't have to think about it. So yeah, after and I was always just, my personality was just, I always dove in there, and I'm not, maybe this is to my detriment as well, but I have no compunction about throwing away old code, legacy code, which it turns out worked out really well at the beginning of my career. We were a relatively new system, and so when I said I want to throw out all our existing Java code for application X, and I think we can do it better, let me rewrite it. My boss was just kind of like, well, he was like, no. And then I said, well, I've already done it, so can we just use it? I was pretty brash, and so he's like, well, okay. Anyways, it worked out well then. I didn't get punished by, usually that's a mistake to just throw out legacy code. So as the system grew in size and scope, that tactic didn't continue to work as well. So anyways, that's, but I was always, that's what I think led me to architecting things. I just love that stuff. I love thinking about small details and doing coding, thinking about unit tests and functions at a very low level. And I really enjoy also architecting things at the big level and thinking about the big picture. And I think, that sort of looking at things big and small is what makes good engineers. I mean, and so I was happy to sort of fill the voids of, when we had a new capability that comes along and the government says, hey, we want you, can you do facial recognition, or can you think of a way to detect kernel rootkits or something? I was enjoyed jumping in there saying, okay, well, none of us knows how to solve this problem, so I don't feel out of place that I don't know how to solve it either. Let's figure it out. And
Right.
like the blank sheet of paper was not terribly daunting,
Right.
which
Okay.
it is for some people, and I recognize that. And so, that's something I've learned is noticing that, hey, for example, one of my coworkers, I always thought he's the smartest guy and one of the greatest people I like to work with. And it took me a long time to realize that, hey, he didn't enjoy that, looking at a blank piece of paper, a new thing. So eventually I was like, oh, okay, let me not stress him out with that thinking about that stuff. But he loves to fix bugs and stuff. So, I'll try to take care of this architecting stuff.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So you took the piece because that was you took the design piece because that was the complement to the rest of your team. Were you was there anything else major? So anything, any other major learnings about cybersecurity or style of working, and then, or should we talk about the next phase of your?
No, this is a long phase.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's hard to break it down when I'm like, I can't talk about, oh, I switched this company, this company. There's clearly demarked phases. But yeah, over those years, I learned a lot of things. So I guess like sort of the first half of my career was being a straight engineer. So something that stands when I joined and I started working, okay, let me actually back up a little bit. When I was growing up, my dad was he worked for the US government and Department of Commerce. And he was somebody's boss. But I didn't know really what he did. He never brought his work home, which I thought, when I look back on it, it's really sweet. When he came home, he was just a dad. But there was one day, one weekend, where he came home and he was beside himself. He was so stressed and bothered because he had to do employee evaluations. And he spent all weekend because my dad's like he's the nicest, sweetest guy. And he had to give a bad evaluation because he had an employee who was not doing good. And it was just killing him all weekend. He just couldn't bring himself to write the thing up. He did, but I saw that. And so I swore, I was like, I never want to be in management. I don't want to be responsible for people's lives. I don't want to ever have to fire somebody. That sounds horrible. So when I started working, I just said to myself and all my friends, I was like, hey, my coworkers, I was like, hey, I'm an engineer. Okay. Like I define myself as an engineer. These are the skills I bring. I don't want to do that stuff. I will focus on the technical stuff. But it doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that easily. Because as the years go on, I was like, I can't help but just be nosy. And I realized, hey, a large part of our jobs, something you've talked about it previously was, what makes like a 10x developer.
Yes.
And I think, part of what makes someone a great engineer is you got to realize all the things that you have to care about that may not be in your job description or may not be technical, or the things that, like, I feel like I'm constantly discovering new parts of the job that I can help and bring value to. So one of those was management and hiring, and was just the whole, like, I started realizing like, hey, I can work as much as I want and try to be heads down, just work on code. But that will never work because I'm surrounded by a team of people. And so the people who are around me are critically important. And there's a limit to how far I scale. So,
Right.
this is the engineer mindset of just realizing like, yeah, okay, I don't want to be involved in hiring and firing, but I feel like I have to, because I think it's just really important to hire the right people. And I would talk to other managers who were responsible, and they had different philosophies. And I just thought, for example, I don't agree with this philosophy that some of them had of like, well, it's okay to have a low bar for hiring. We can just evaluate them and get rid of people if they don't work out, and just as long as we're liberal about getting rid of people that don't work out, we don't have to be that stringent in interviews. And to me, that never sat right. And so I was like, I need to get involved in interviewing and hiring, because we need to be really picky. And I just think we need to be really picky. It's really important. Like there's almost nothing more important than having the right people. If you have a bad hire, that's just, the ripple effects are just enormous.
Right. The interesting thing to me out of kind of what you just said there is, I mean, so from what I'm hearing, you didn't want to be a manager because you had that early experience with your father. You watched
Yeah.
him just really struggle because he had to possibly, potentially, eventually fire someone in the worst case, but in the best case, it was to deliver bad news. Hey, you're
Right.
underperforming.
Yeah.
And then you're watching at this time, you're the chief architect and you're watching the managers around you go, no, we'll just throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And you've got this compassionate position almost where you're saying, I don't want somebody to come in here, first of all, mess everything up, and then we have to fire them as well.
Yeah,
That's a real
yeah, you're right. That's a
devastating
whole
move for them personally and for the business. And so, in conclusion, it's almost an argument to say that these brutally hard interviews that people go through are compassionate. Like it's
Well,
I mean,
let's
let's not go too far, but
no, let's go down a little. Let's talk about interviewing. I have a lot of
yeah,
thoughts about interviewing.
yeah,
Because I also know I don't think the industry does it right either.
right.
I think we all are doing it wrong. I don't necessarily have solutions, but I have a lot of thoughts about the goods and bads about how to do interviews right. And so, no, I don't think the sort of Facebook, Google, Microsoft standard of leak code style, grueling data structures, algorithms, interviews, where they're grilling you on stuff you learned in college. So if you're straight out of college, you might ace those things, and then if you're an experienced engineer, you're like struggling and sweating. And no, I don't think that doesn't make any sense to me. But I absolutely do think that like being picky about interviewing is important. So the thing is, I don't come from like Silicon Valley. So where I am at, I'm on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. That's where we are. So all these stories I hear when people work at companies and they have an open position and 100 people apply, that's not the world I live in. We don't get 100 people applying to our open positions. We're not in the boonies. I'm not saying that. I'm in the suburbs. But when resumes trickle in, and they don't flood in when we open a position. We open a position, and then I'll get 1 or 2 resumes a week or a few a month. It's right. So I have to. I never had the luxury of going, I'm going to be just grilling people like left and right and center. But I've always thought like, hey, the really important thing about interviewing is trying to figure out who is going to work out here, and trying to have questions that sort of can tell me that. So this might be a weird connection to make, but I think of it in terms of like, I might butcher this name, like Kolmogorov complexity. So in information theory, they're like, ideally every bit that you have in information gives you equal probability of true or false, equal probability of success or failure. And if so, I think, like I said, this is weird, but I think of this in terms of questions. Every question I want to ask, if it's a question, I want to learn something from every question. I want to learn the maximum amount of information, because in an hour you can only ask so much and learn so much. So I want to ask questions that if somebody passes the question, it makes me want to hire them. And if they fail the question, it makes me not want to hire them. And I think that's a bar that a lot of the questions that get asked don't pass. So let me give an example. So on one hand, I've been in many interviews where people will ask pretty easy questions, or they will ask, like, say a common thing is someone will say, oh, you want to be a Java programmer? Tell me what's the difference between an abstract class and an interface, or tell me how do you build a string without when strings are immutable. And the answer might be, oh, there's a string builder class out there. And to me, the value of those questions is very low, because when somebody passes them, gets them right, it doesn't mean much. Right. You're not like, I haven't learned that you're a great programmer. I guess if you fail it, I mean, I can definitely read something into that, but most people will pass easy questions. And so if you ask a series of, and also if you start asking questions about library functions and obscure features and languages, if somebody gets those wrong, then I don't know. I'm just like, maybe they just don't know what that is. And it doesn't mean I don't want to hire them if they just don't happen to like have the whole API reference in their heads. I don't learn much from that, right?
Yeah, that's what,
on the other
hand,
what
Google is there for. And on Stack Overflow, that's what you're there for.
Exactly. So, and then, so on the completely opposite end of the spectrum is like the leak code style of interview, where okay, so let me give you this problem. You have n balls and you want to take m of them, and then you have a list that you want to reverse in place and whatever. If somebody passes that, that's a pretty good sign, actually. Like, anybody who can pass those kind of questions, it does tell you a lot. Like, they're probably a pretty good developer. You know that they can pass a FizzBuzz test or something. But if somebody fails a question like that, to me, that doesn't tell me that they're a bad hire.
Right.
And if it doesn't tell me something negative about them when they don't get it right, then I don't think it's the best use of time, because then I'm just saying, well, do I care if this candidate remembers a depth first search off the top of their head? Not really.
Right.
Maybe they just, because I'm like, and if someone actually gets that right, is it because they're a wizard at algorithms, or is it because they were just studying a LeetCode problem that was just like the one I asked?
And that was the exact one that they had the night before.
Yeah, so they aced it.
Yeah, right. So
so where I like to do is like a strategy is, and I think I've heard a lot of people doing this. So I like to, questions I think should be more as close to day-to-day work as possible. So a couple things, I have a whole series of questions that I've been putting together in my downtime before I start my next job, that I want to start trying out in my future interviews. And so a couple of them are, I've taken Stack Overflow questions and I've just like, hey, I rephrase them as interview questions and see if somebody can answer them, because these are very self-contained problems. They're usually very practical problems. They don't require, and there's no mathematical notation about n and x and stuff like that. Like, you talk like the people that post on there talk like real people.
Right.
So I think those make good questions. And they don't, I think a good question doesn't require, it's not about thinking up a clever algorithm. It's more, can you do this relatively easy to understand task, but it might be a little tricky. But it's very realistic. So I guess a spoiler for the few people that might, watch this, and the one guy that I actually interview in the future who's listen to this.
If somebody sits through this entire interview, hire them anyways, because
exactly.
charity, right?
if you listen to the program podcast,
yeah,
I probably want you right there.
That's right.
So for example, I have one question that I like is a typical task is you run a command and you capture its output. So I want to run ping or something, and then say the output is a string. You can do that in any programming language. The twist that I think that in my question is, how can I do that on something like ping if it's going to, or top, that runs continuously and doesn't exit? And how can you capture its output? And I've beta tested this on a few friends, and it's worked out well, because it's I think a very easy problem to understand, but it's kind of tricky to solve, but doesn't require any craziness. Right. It's just, oh, that's interesting. You can't just wait for it to stop. So you have to capture the output as it's going. So you have to have some sort of, the output is continually changing over time. Things might get added over time. So I can't just return a string. I don't know what you come up with. I have to make an event system where I fire events, or I have to make a stream of data, something, it's more complicated.
Right.
Nothing crazy. And I'm hoping that kind of question is, that won't make anybody like sweat in an unfair way.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so this is, if we get back onto the track, this is, you move from this architect thing into you are the manager of these people.
Yeah, half and half. The classic, it's funny, like I said, we didn't use titles, so I didn't realize the industry had names for these things, like tech lead. Right. So for years I was like, I'm like this, I'm half an engineer and half a manager. and then I find out once I leave and I'm looking for a job, I'm like, oh, they call this tech lead. Okay.
Tech lead, right.
We have a name for this.
So what sorts of challenges are added to your plate when you are managing, as a tech lead, other developers? Like what?
There's, um, man, it's so many. So I think one of the ones that time was just a huge issue. Um, like many engineers, I don't multitask well. And, when I'm coding, I can work on one problem and, I work on it best if I focus on it and I can work on it straight, no interruptions. Well, managing really doesn't, it requires not just you have to handle interruptions, but it's almost a skill. Multitasking is actually a valuable skill when you're managing because you have to think about what everybody is doing. And I really respect it. I looked at the bosses that I had that I really respected, and I looked at them. I'm like, you have. I'll admit, I was like, you have intellectual skills I don't have. You are able to just. Someone can ask you a question about, there's 20 different things we're working on, and they could ask a question about any one of those 20 things, and they have an answer off the top of their head, a smart answer. They don't have to like, oh, let me think about it, let me get back to you. But that's what I would do. I'm like, oh geez, I'm thinking about my problem. You're gonna have to give me 60 seconds to just shift the gears over.
Yeah,
And they're screeching while I'm doing that.
switching, we
Yeah.
call that. That's
Yeah.
the cognitive process of, okay, I'm focused here. Now I've got to be here. This is the context switch. And one of the things they say is it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to get back, even from the tiniest interruption, to get back onto
Yeah.
your current problem. So the first thing you're detecting as an issue, how did you get better at that? How did you get better at context switching? Was it practice or was there more to it? Anything deliberate?
That's a great question. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know that I got better at that. Um, that, and I might sell myself short or something, but that is just one of those problems that I was basically conflicted about because, um, like I said, time was an issue, and I started noticing like, hey, now I am attending more meetings, and there's sort of a critical mass where if I was doing 2 meetings a week, that's fine. But when I have 2 meetings a day, even though those 2 meetings only take 2 hours, it just kills it. I'm like, I have 2 meetings, I can barely get any actual coding done. So the time is a huge issue because I can't multitask. I would end up like I got by for a couple of years where I would just like, well, I'll just have to focus on the management side and helping people out and unblocking them, going, making sure their careers are on track. Like that's really important. And I didn't reconcile it because my engineering side just suffered for that. I just wasn't making as much stuff as I was before.
Right. So
Um,
that's a classic question, actually. Should engineering managers code? And typically the answer is absolutely not. They should focus 100% on not coding because that's what the coders are for.
yeah.
So you mentioned just the tiniest snippet of making sure your direct reports, or did you
Mhm.
also have skip
No, I was the lowest rung of manager. We
lowest
only
rung
had
of
2 months.
manager? So you had 15, but you had 15 direct reports.
I had, yeah, yes.
So tell me then,
Too many.
yeah, that does seem like way too many to really, especially if you're trying to fit any of your own code time in there. That's seems like a problem. But how do you what do you do to tell others to get their career on track? What are you watching for? How are you assisting? What do you tell them?
Yeah. So I thought that, like I said, I learned a lot by always compare, like seeing what I thought were deficiencies elsewhere. And so I was like, I saw that like, hey, other managers might um put the value, like what the program needs or the company needs are first. And I, while I was weirdly loyal, like staying at a company for 10 years, and so I was a company man, I also was just very much about, I was like, you know what? I am a human being, and I just like as a person, I just want to look out for the people that are under me. And I did that. I kind of got away with just almost prioritizing that completely over the company's needs. So I would talk to them regularly, all the time. I think it's really important to just talk to everybody. And you have to make yourself, you have to put, well, now I read management books, and and the idea of, hey, you have to put deliberate time into going out and reaching out to people. I actually wasn't, I was, that was something I had to learn over my few years doing this, of you don't just passively, you have to make an effort. Like, being a manager is a skill. The same way being a teacher, just because you know the subject, teaching is its own skill that requires lots of work. And so I realize management is its own skill that requires a lot of work. But lots of people don't realize that, and because you can physically show up at the job and put your hours in and not realize that, like, here's all the things you should be doing as a manager. So yeah, I would I just remember, like, so when I had any of them that expressed unhappiness about something, a couple times, they were like, hey, I would like to work on this other project. To me, I immediately was just like, I want to make this happen. Like, or if you want to go back to school, I want to make this happen, because I do not want unhappy employees. I don't want to say, like, no, I need you on my project. I was just like, to me, I was just like, I'll figure out how to handle you
Right.
leaving. But if you were going to be happy over there, I want to make that happen. It'll make me happy too, to just not have, I just couldn't stand the thought of telling somebody, the bad news, and be like, no, you need to do this thing that you don't enjoy. So yeah, I did that explicitly. I was like, one of the guys that worked for me, he was like, I want to work on this weapon system over here. And I said, okay, I'm going to work to get you on that, even though this hurts me.
Yeah.
But that's fine. Like, we will, hey, you know what, if we should never lose one person, and that shouldn't kill our program. That's just a sign of bad management, and I'm a manager, so that's my problem. That's not
Right.
your problem. That's,
Yeah.
I'll make sure the bus factor is low or whatever, so we can deal with people moving around. People should have that freedom. Because like, in our industry, or in our company, I don't know if it's a company thing or the defense industry as a whole, but like, people get stuck in places. It's not like the Silicon Valley, say, where people are just changing jobs all the time and there's lots of mobility. And it's kind of to the detriment of, when people aren't internally moving around between projects, you're not circulating ideas and information. And similarly, and now I've realized that staying at one company myself, there's, we are not hiring a lot from the outside and bringing in outside knowledge. We are not, no one's moving around. So that's
Right.
this.
Cross-pollination.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And you've talked about it. I know that's a thing that you're really interested in, thinking about. I'm like, yeah, that is definitely a problem that we have suffered from where I'm from.
Yeah.
So
Well, I guess, I mean, I was 10 years at my last job, and all of these things that you're talking about, sort of getting stuck in your position, and that just really resonates with me, because, you maybe get complacent. It maybe gets a little easy. You maybe have a lot of fear and anxiety around, well, I'm happy here, but what if I leave and it sucks?
yeah,
Like, how bad would it be? So, but you've been doing, so you've done the management. Is there anything else major that comes out of your time as a manager that you think are just really great lessons that are worth sharing?
boy, there's so many, but I'm so bad at coming up with examples on the spot. So I mean, those are the big ones that I think about all the time. Like I said, like, it's just, I guess one thing that I'm really, another takeaway is that I really think it's super important for managers to be engineers.
Right.
I think that is, so I would notice, and I would think, it's just bothered me when we'd have people running projects and running teams, and they're not themselves engineers. And I think the one major thing that you lose. Okay, so I often think, like, when I would encounter big problems, and I say, hey, this system is, okay, let me give an example. I worked on a system, sort of brought over to help out with this one system, and we sort of, I had them, sort of learn the architecture and what's going on in the system. And it was a legacy thing that they rewrote and tried to update. Which is a great thing. They tried to update and put in a new modern programming language. It was done in Ada, like an old defense thing.
Well, that's old.
So they tried to update it, and but in the process, they took what was like their backend data storage, and they said, okay, we're going to use like a SQL database now because the legacy system didn't even have something like that. But this database, when I looked into it, it was weird. I was like, why are these? There's like the tables all have like two columns, like a timestamp or ID kind of thing, and then like all the data is stored in this other column, and it's just big binary blobs. And it's like, this is weird. That's really bad. I was like, there's no structure to the data. You, for all kinds of reasons, I'm like, it's not broken into 100 columns like it should be. You can't do any queries on it. You can't update these, like you can't do insert and update statements and select statements. They had to just, it was a SQL statement, SQL database in name, but in practice,
It was
you
a
just pull the
flat
data
file.
into memory and then have all this custom deserialization code to parse all this binary data. I was like, it's taking advantage of almost none of the features of a SQL database. So when I brought this up to upper management of the project, they didn't get it. And no matter how much I try to just explain like the absolute horror, all of us engineers that are working on this, like we're all just like talking to each other and just going, oh my God, we're rolling our eyes like, oh my God, this is terrible. But when we brought up to non-engineers, managers, they didn't get it. And I sort of realized that that is why you need technical management, because there's no substitute for feeling in your soul, in your gut, how a system is. Like like how bad a system like that is, you need to feel it, like the pain level. I would be personally pained to work on that system, but I was like, they're not pained. All they can do is just look at us engineers and be like, well, you say this is bad. Okay. They have no emotional connection to it.
Right.
And I think that's like a thing that's missing. And I don't know, people don't talk about that much. And just like, but this, I think most of the things we work on, you generally have like a visceral reaction when you see a bad piece of code.
Right.
Before you really can dive in and figure out exactly what's wrong with it, you can kind of look at something and go, oh my God, this is like, I have to fix this.
Yeah. And having the empathy for the team that's about to go through this problem, and you being able to act as a firewall between the upper management and the right. You say, no, this really is as hard as it's.
Yeah, you need your tech lead or something. So like if your tech lead or your project manager or whatever, if they're not seeing this, but if if somebody told me, hey, we have a database and it has one column in it in every table, I would just viscerally go, oh my God, that can't be right.
Makes no sense.
That can't be right. You have to fix that.
Yeah.
So
are you deliberate? Have you been deliberate about professional development throughout your career?
It's an interesting question. You know what? I'm going to be honest. No, I don't think I have. So over all this time that my whole life, I've been, in the past 10 years, I've been on Stack Overflow answering questions, and I did it for fun.
Yeah.
I enjoy talking about code and, helping people out. And I didn't do it for any particular purpose except for enjoyment. But I think looking at it, like that has helped my development, because I see what people are talking about out there, and I see over time they start mentioning a new library or a new language comes out, and I start seeing everything is tagged with TypeScript or something, and I'm like, I haven't seen this before. Oh, what is that? I got to look into this, because now I'm seeing this pop up a lot. I'm really thankful, because I don't know what I would do if I didn't have that. If Stack Overflow working on there all the time, I don't know what would have, like, where would I be stuck in legacy land,
Isn't that interesting? Well, I mean, absolutely would you, but that's so interesting. In marketing a few years ago, there started being all of these articles about cool hunters, and cool hunters are people who go out onto the streets of major cities. They'll go to New York, they'll go to LA, and they'll go to where the kids hang out. So they'll go to parks and things, and they bring their cameras and they go look for and they snap photos of groups of kids, and what they're looking for are the trends, right? So there's the article Cool Hunting. I guess this must have been a Malcolm
I was gonna
Gladwell
say, this
type.
sounds like a Malcolm Gladwell thing.
Yeah. And so the cool hunters, they look for the trends. And so you are the programming cool hunter
Yeah,
by
apparently.
watching. You can watch the tags, you watch the what's cool, what's coming, and you watch
Yeah.
Stack Overflow, and you're going to know before any of us.
Yeah, like I haven't been in the web world, but it's kept me at least alert of what's going on. So, when people started talking about JSON and REST APIs, I was like, I got to look into this because there's so much traffic about this kind of stuff. And then, like a thing that, like a year ago or something, I started seeing questions about GraphQL. And I was like, okay, what's that? And I look it up and and I was like, oh, this is incredible. I haven't even worked in this space for years, but this is incredible. It's like, I'm like, this is solving problems that I would have had if I was working there.
GraphQL, my opinion on GraphQL is that it is the biggest thing to happen to APIs since REST was released in 2000. It's the biggest move for APIs in the last 20 years. Even though it was released sort of open source 5 years ago, and
right.
it really, like, I think Condé Nast picked it up in 2018, and so there's the super early adopters hype curve, right? Where if you're grabbing it just in 2015, you don't know if it's going to get the support or if it's going to be enterprise ready, or if you're ready to handle the big bugs that are coming. But a few years in, now you see the big players. Netflix uses it extensively. Condé Nast uses it. There are a handful, like, it's Facebook. So there's enough big players out there using GraphQL that I think it's kind of ready for the next tier. I think it's going to take over. There's a lot of people there's no reason not to do a GraphQL if you're greenfield.
Yes, I hope. I'm hoping that's the thing, because it's just, there's these developments in computing where I read about them. I'm like, this is just, wow, it's just so obvious. This is the way to do it. Like, this is so elegant and so clever, and so in retrospect obvious seeming. But that's the mark of like a great idea, is if you hear about it, you're like, oh, of course that's the way to do it.
Right.
And I didn't, but honestly, like, you do a REST API and it fits in with how HTTP works. But then you're like, oh shoot, I'm getting too many results. I have to do pagination. And then, oh, I have to make all these endpoints. And then this thing comes along. It's just like, hey, don't worry about all that stuff.
We got everything.
You can get any piece of data you want in any format. You tell me what you want, I'll give it to you. And it's like, I didn't even think of it that way, but that makes so much sense.
It's one endpoint, only the fields that you want. It's just, now, are you seeing a lot of gRPC as well? Global remote procedure call?
I have not. I have seen that. I have not looked into that.
I think it's probably a bit more back-endy, so it might be sort of exploding, but in a much smaller niche. But I am
the entire web world. I'm going to I'm gonna have to inundate myself with new knowledge, because I am well out of date with that stuff, and I'm excited to get in there, because I was when I left my place, working for defense contractors, like, all right, I just feel like I have to work in cloud or web or mobile apps, or like, those are the places. That's what people are doing. I actually right in my last year, I started dabbling with DevOps, and that was another thing when I learned about.
Let's talk about the DevOps, and then we'll talk about what your new role is. So it looks like you were a manager for almost 10 years.
No, it blurs together. I was a manager for a few years.
Okay, a few years, and then you move into DevOps. Did you say, okay, I'm done with managing?
Everything that I put there was added on top
Yeah.
Nothing ever got subtracted.
Okay. Oh, okay. I see. So it wasn't Game of Thrones and somebody overthrew you and you're
No.
like, yeah,
For one, I mean, DevOps as a philosophy is kind of a cornerstone is that you don't silo your DevOps. You shouldn't have DevOps people, um, which is a mistake that we immediately started making when I started working on this stuff. I was like, oh, we don't have time for all the developers to work on this. Let's hire some guys to do
right.
DevOps. But uh, I know that that is a mistake. Everybody should be doing DevOps. So for people who aren't aware, DevOps is, God, it's like this term that can mean anything you want. It's a philosophy about how to do things, and it's like doing things. It's like agile, automated testing, just automating everything. But it's also the agile in how you run your program. So they're just like, yeah, let's throw all that stuff in, and then we'll just grab all the Scrum and all that kind of stuff, and we'll take credit for that whole side of things, but we also want to take credit for infrastructure as a service and all these as a service things. That's all us too.
Yeah.
And let's grab all the security things too. We want to be DevSecOps. It's just, but there's I love it because there's really I kind of think of this in two ways. It's funny, like as an engineer, a lot of times it's so much easier for us if we compartmentalize our ideas and say, okay, instead of designing an entire circuit board and laying out all the wires, I need chips that I can, and different chips that do different things. I have adders and I have, flip-flops or whatever, but that's really low level. But you need building blocks and you build them into components, and everything is layered components. But I think a very different way, problem with that is sometimes what we do requires holistic, big thinking where it reaches into everything, and DevOps is like this octopus with tentacles reaching everywhere, where it's like you can't just have one guy work on automated testing on the side. Your whole team needs to work on this. Your whole team needs to embrace agile, all these things that everybody needs to be thinking about. And hey, it's not just some tools that you can use. It is Docker, it is Kubernetes, but it's also a mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah, that stuff, that is like candy to me. I can eat as much, unlimited amount of that.
Okay. So how did you decide to adopt Docker? Right? Like,
Docker, sorry, go.
well,
Yeah,
I'm just thinking, so, what, or if you were maybe on a virtual machine, maybe you had a VM in rack space, or maybe bare metal in a thing, how do you go from that and say, listen, we've got to rewrite everything to use Docker? And how did you know that it was ready for prime time? When did you start watching it? Like, what's the decision process that brings you to moving to a container system from where you were? So,
well, the sad answer is we didn't get there, not in the time I was there. It takes more than a year to
yeah.
switch to Docker. But for me at a personal level, when VMware first came out back in the early 2000s, I was in college, and it was one of those, like I talked about in the beginning, seeing a Doom level editor and code, and I didn't understand it. When virtual machines came out, I was just blown away. I was like, how is this a thing? I have Linux. I ran it. I was a college kid and I paid $200 so I could get VMware. And I was just like, I have Linux inside of Windows. It's incredible. And I remember that forever. So when I learned about Docker, it was like the same feeling of just like, this is a complete game changer. This is solving all these problems I've had with deployment and packaging up all your software. And I've been struggling with these problems for years, never having great solutions. It's all really complicated. And it's like, wow. But it's like, it felt like this perfect thing where I'm like, it feels like virtual machines without all the downsides of virtual machines. You don't have this dedicated, self-contained system sitting somewhere else that's running at full Linux. It's just your process and the libraries it needs and whatever else it needs inside this container. But it looks like a VM and it pretends to be a VM, but it has like almost none of the overhead
right.
of all of that. And I don't have to spend 45 minutes installing a virtual machine, Docker will like, I'm like, oh, I want to test out a Docker image from online. I run a command and 5 seconds later, there I am, it's running. It was incredible. So it hit me on the, like, that's like another example of just, you need to feel things, you know?
Yeah.
Because where we suffered was, hey, we were a defense contractor, so this stuff, nobody understood it, and we talked about containers all the time, but nobody felt it because they were either not engineers, or they were engineers who had never used it. And I was just always trying to push people, please just spend a day and go try it out. You're gonna love it. Like, but
Yeah.
no matter how much I explain this to you, you're not gonna get it. But if you just use it for a day, it should just open up new paths and everything. But no, sadly, the defense world is just not, to no surprise, it's not very fast moving. It is faster moving than I thought it was before I started working in it. We did always have really nice hardware to work on, tons of, you know, processor power and RAM and everything. But new paradigm shifts like DevOps, switching to containers, no, really hard sell. And actually, more than even a hard sell, it was actually, people did start to get sold on it, but it's also really hard to do it correctly.
Yes.
Like, just saying we should do this stuff, but then when someone, you know, a manager would give a presentation about the value of containers, and they would like, well, these are virtual machines. And I would always just go, they're not virtual machines. We're starting on the whole wrong foundation here. And also just DevOps wise, you know, I was like, well, we need to automate testing. So the Navy and the military, they have just a long history of everything on a submarine or a ship or a plane. You know, they have paper procedures, 100-page procedures, checklists and steps they got to run through. So you want to do this, they run through 26 steps, and they sign their names, and they're checking off steps. And, you know, the people that we hired were all a lot of ex-military people. So that's the mindset they're in, which this is how you test a system.
Right.
You software guys go make it. And then when we test it, we're going to throw it in a lab, and then somebody is going to click buttons and run through paper procedures for days.
Right.
DevOps. So I was, you know, they could understand the concept of automated testing, but it was far too radical. I was pushing, like, we need not just unit tests, which is something that I think most people could understand, you know, write little tests that test bits of code. But I was like, the value is really in like integration tests, system level tests. You have all these layers of testing, and we need those, all these other kinds of testing, and we need to automate these. And hey, bad news, guys, like, your job is as a QA guy, I don't think that job has value if we do this right. I don't want there to be people running through paper procedures in 10 years. We need to get rid of all that. All of that stuff can be scripts.
Yeah.
We can get there, and, you know, and I don't know, it's one of those things that reminds me of politics or something, where there's a point where you can't convince people of new ideas. You just have to wait for a new generation of people come in with those new ideas who get it
With
already.
the new ideas all
They just get it.
Okay. Okay.
You know?
So that's interesting. So you have since this time. So what happened after 14 years in one place to convince you that you were ready to start looking externally for another job?
I think mistakes were made. I made mistakes of, I just grew up with this, you know, my mom, my dad worked for the US government. You just work there for 30 years, you retire, you get a pension. My mom worked for IBM back in the day. Man, that was you're just a company man, you know, you just work for 30 years, get your retirement. I ingrained that as when I was growing up, and I was like, yeah, that sounds great. I want to do that. I want to work for a place for my, I didn't actually think I want to work for my whole life, but you know, it was very easy to me to just go, I should just stay here. That's what you do. you don't run away when there are problems. I should fix these problems. But I think looking back on it now, I should have left there years ago.
Right.
Um, uh, I hate giving up on problems, but I didn't know when to just say, this is not the place. Like, maybe I don't fit in here.
Right.
Maybe, if nobody's buying the DevOps Kool-Aid that I'm trying to sell, maybe I should go somewhere where I don't have to sell it. They already drink
Where
it.
you don't have to sell. That's right. Oh, that's a great, if nobody's buying the thing I'm selling, maybe I should go somewhere where they've already bought it. I
should
love
go to the
that.
Kool-Aid factory and work there.
That's right. Yeah, just go there. So have you started at this new place yet?
No, I have. So I finally worked up the nerve right in like March of last year. I was like, that's it, I'm done here. I'm leaving. Oh shoot, there's a pandemic. Wait a minute.
That's right. Yeah.
Can I have my letter of resignation back?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I stuck around for a while, but then COVID and the whole pandemic was just, at first I loved working from home and I was getting more done than I ever had. And because I was able to program again and code, and the management side, I didn't need to do so much of it. It was really nice. Then it became the exact opposite, where I was like, oh, working from home is just, I can't do it anymore. Because it's like, I was like, as I think a lot of us do, and we don't admit, I'm like, yeah, if I'm surfing Reddit or something, that's not working. And then I started realizing, I'm like, it's so easy to give into temptation and not work. Also, I could just, for just many reasons, I just was like, I want to see people again. I want to be around the office environment and talk to people. So anyways, I was like, I'm not proud of the work that I'm doing. I should just not work for a while until this thing blows over and I can go back and do an amazing job instead of disappointing myself about, what even hurt more the most was that nobody else knew that I wasn't doing a good job. They were all continue just going, you're great, you're doing a good job, we love you. And it feels very disingenuous, or like it feels wrong, to get away with something like that. And I think as a junior person, if you can't get away with that stuff, people will call you out and say you're not doing a good job. But I felt like you get a reputation, and then I didn't like coasting on that. So yeah, I quit. It took now it's been like 9 months off.
Oh my.
It's been really nice and refreshing.
They call that the pro leisure circuit. That's
yeah. And I got to do like, I said I'm a musician also, like that's my other big thing. So I just got to spend a lot of time doing that. And I was like, I can't put that much energy into that while I'm working all the time. So it's been really nice. And now I'm prepared to go back to work. And I just feel like the energy's back, I could take all the things that I was bothered by, and instead of being bothered by them, now I'm like, I could take positive energy to the new place,
Yeah.
And just feel like I can do good.
Have you found this new place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I got a new place, and it's I'm really happy. Hopefully it's gonna work out well. Like you've, I don't know. So I definitely am a little nervous. I'm like, the unknown is always, I'm like, I hope I like these people. I hope I get along with them. But I know that everybody pretty much says very few people regret changing jobs.
Right.
Especially if you're not happy at a place. Not that I was miserable, but most people don't. Yeah. And whatever. And then I don't have to make the same mistake. I don't have to work in the next place 15 years.
Correct. That's right. You can
lesson learned there, hopefully.
Lesson learned. Okay. So this is the phase we're going to start to wrap up, but is there anything else any stories or anything else you would want to talk about? Do you have any soapbox issues?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I was just hoping to talk a little about Stack Overflow. I don't know if you have any questions
absolutely.
or you want to know what that's like. I feel like on the internet, I hear lots and lots of users of Stack Overflow, and people really are bitter about it. I think a lot of people have bad experiences on there. And so I'm like, well, I can give some perspective from what it's like to be one of those guys that is closing your questions and doing
Oh, yes,
evil
because
stuff, you know?
I guess so, because you are a super user for sure. And so you would be one of the ones who sees a question, goes, not a good question, bam,
Yeah,
out.
exactly.
Okay,
I'm that guy.
so let's hear it.
I'm the
Let's,
tyrant.
yeah.
Um, no, but like I absolutely sympathize with that. There's such a different view, I think, of a resource like that when you are someone asking and trying to get help versus you're the person that helps all the time. So when you are someone who's asking a question, it's a brutal, brutal place. Um, Almost certainly, if you ask a question on there, you're going to get downvoted. Someone's going to comment that like your question's a duplicate. Um, you know, it's not even a good question. Have you done any research?
That's
And
funny. The one that got me most of all is I asked a question on Stack Overflow, and I think I started with "Hi there." Said, "Hi there, thanks for reading," or some sort of pleasantry, and then I got it, and it's always, and then at the end I would say, "Thank you for reading my question," and somebody came along and edited it to take out the "hi there" and the "thank you," and and, I, and so I had to go through the rules of Stack Overflow, and it was like, I think the rules are, this is a questions forum. We have no time and there is no place for pleasantries. Just go to the question and shut up.
yeah,
And
just
so
ask your question, Chubb.
that's it. That's it. Don't
It's
be nice. Just
it's
ask your question. And I was blown away. I mean, I adapted. I
yeah.
adapted, but
No, it
it's,
stings, right? It stings to get that kind of feedback. You're like, I was just trying to be nice. What happened?
yeah. Yeah.
Um, I'm like so there was an incident um where there was a whole bunch of Stack Overflow drama like a year ago or something. And even one of the people that works for the company admitted, and they were like, we, the employees of Stack Overflow, like we have panic attacks and we want to post a question or a news update or something. Like our employees, like they can't handle that, the stress of like putting that stuff out there and just getting slammed. So it's like it's even for the employees themselves, it's a nightmare. So so my take on that is, unfortunately, it's just you can have two kinds of websites to help people. You can have a forum, which is
Right.
conversational and friendly, or you can have a reference resource, which is what Stack Overflow tries to be. And it tries to be the place that when you Google a question, you don't wade through a lots of, I have that problem too, and thanks so much. And oh, I tried that and it worked. Thanks for the help. And then what's the answer?
Right.
You know, so they're ruthless. And I say they because that's me too. We're ruthless about trimming that stuff out. So yeah, I am one of the people. If you post, I will edit out, hey, thank you. Any help is appreciated. And I know that like I know what that comes off as. Like I like if I posted and someone did that to me, and they do that to me, I post, they edit my post and it stings, and I'm sitting there like, no, I'm one of you. I'm a power user. Like you
Yeah.
don't do that to me too. But
No,
it's all in the service of I think, you know, what you don't see, the view of I when I go there and I see it, it's a flood of questions coming in.
yeah.
And um not to put a fine point on it, but 95% of them are low quality questions. Um, you know, most people will take a homework assignment or something and they'll paste it in there and hit submit, and that's it. Um, and there's just a flood of that kind of stuff. Or they'll take a work assignment and they'll say my code doesn't work, and they'll describe what they're working on, and they don't post any code. And so when 19 out of 20 posts on there are questions like that, um, people like me, we have to get in the habit of just, you can't spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes helping them out, explaining the rules of the site. Hey, you should have done this. I mean, ideally we would all have the time and energy to do that, but you know, we don't. And even if I try to do that, actually, I try to be as friendly as I can, but I can't make everyone else do that either. You know,
Right.
I'm just
Right.
one of many
Yeah.
people doing this. So yeah, the end result is as a question asker, you're likely gonna just get some negative feedback, and it's gonna be rough.
Yeah. Well,
I posted.
I will admit that in hindsight, after I dealt with my emotional reaction to having my hello removed, I did understand the reason behind it, and it does improve the quality of the resource as a whole, right? Because you go in, you get to your answer, and that's it. And you don't need the hello.
It's just at the expense of lots and lots of hurt feelings.
Yeah.
Which,
And so I think that's, that's understandable. That's understandable. Okay. So what kind of stuff are you going to be doing at the new place?
honestly, I am not sure because it's all classified, so they can only say a little
Oh,
bit.
okay.
So I'll
Okay.
be finding
You're
out.
you're going to be throwing out the old NSA code and you're going to write a new one.
Yeah,
Listening.
they're yes. Funny enough, I've dealt with the NSA at points, and working in cybersecurity, it
Yeah.
was interesting. It was very impressive. I was like, when they come along, like, it felt good. They were one of these places where I was like, they did the Stack Overflow experience to us as a company, where they come in and they say your stuff is terrible, means, you need to clean up these 150 things. And I felt so warm inside to see that. I was like, oh, they're doing a good job. They
Yeah.
really are trying to do a good job. I was blown away by the one engineer that came over from the NSA, and he was just the one, like, it was like a new level of engineer that I'd never experienced before. He was so good at his job. It's funny. Like, for example, he was doing a security proof of our system, and one small thing is he sat there and I watched him hit every single key press on the keyboard, and then he holds down control and hits every single key on the keyboard, and then hits control alt and hits every single key on the keyboard. And he uncovered 26 different hidden menus that would pop up because that's what GNOME does, or that's what our window manager did. And I was like, and he was there for days and he did that kind of stuff, and I was like, that's incredible. I was very reassured by that kind of thing. And so that was one of those things I took away from that. That was early on my career, and I just I felt good about. I don't know about the all the bad stuff the NSA does, but I was like, I like the idea that, hey, really competent people are out there watching over us.
Doing the yeah.
Yeah, that
Oh
felt
yeah.
good.
I mean, yeah. Everything else aside, at least they're really good. Anyways, okay. Well, now I see you've got this section in there that I really love. There was this philosophy section. Do you have that up in front of you?
Yes.
What I don't know how to introduce that. And I wonder, maybe can you read this to us and just give us a bit of a chat about, so for context for the people watching at home, I have John's resume in front of me, and he has this block of section called philosophy, where he describes well, why don't you tell me about it? Tell me about this block, and then tell me what the points are in it, and we'll just get pure wisdom.
Don't oversell. You set me up here. Yeah, no, like I said, I think a lot about hiring. And so I thought, something I wish people put in if I was getting resumes, or like, my personal take on, like, I was like, I ended up, when I was interviewing people, I would ignore all their employment section, their whole job history. I would ask nothing about it. I developed that. I trimmed it down over the years, and I was like, you know what? I wish they would just write in opinions about stuff. And I would ask questions when I'm interviewing people, like, what do you like? I just want to get people's. I just feel like if I just had this feeling of like, hey, if you're a really good, if you're the kind of person I want to work with, you have opinions about the tools you use. You have opinions about how things should be done. And so I was like, well, you know what? I will be the change I want to see in the world. I'm going to put this in the resume. Everybody says keep your resume as short as possible. I'm going to violate that completely and just fill up the front of it with some opinions. So yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. Not so I just put decisions always involve trade-offs. Being overly principled is harmful. Great engineers understand that good principles sometimes don't get along with each other. I mean, it kind of explains itself, but like that's one of the things I organize in my head. Like when I'm mapping out the world, I'm just like, you know what? There just never is like a clear answer about things. Like almost never. Like you don't get a GraphQL that comes along that often. Usually
Right.
you find something and there's just pros and cons, and it's really complicated and thorny. Um, and so yeah, I have on here designing and coding are intertwined. Neither comes first. Um, you you have to work all that stuff out. Um, like big design up front doesn't work. I loved it when Agile came along. That wasn't there when I was getting into this industry. And so I was just so on board when that became a thing. Extreme programming was like the precursor. And I enjoyed seeing that develop over the years, because I think I was kind of on one of the forums where they sort of started developing these ideas. And it was fascinating when for years, I was participating on there and talking with these guys, and it was exciting. And then when it caught on actually in the world,
Right.
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't
Yeah.
believe that this was popular, and it changed everything. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
That's your designing and coding are intertwined is an interesting point. I have Clean Architecture, the Robert Martin book.
Mhm.
And in there, he says it's actually super important that the architect is also hands-on coding,
Yeah.
because what you can't do is design the system on your system design thing where you draw your boxes and the arrows point all
Yeah.
over, and then just think, oh, it's going to be fine. Just go do that. I'm off in my ivory tower architecting. No,
It
you've got to be right in there at the level of the pain with everybody
Yes,
else. Yeah.
absolutely. It doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense when I always felt like if your engineers should be the smartest people, the most technical. You don't get someone else to do the hard work, and then we're the ones that are thinking about the system all the time and mulling it over. It doesn't make sense to outsource that work to someone else who
Right.
may not even be a programmer. It doesn't. I don't get it. That was actually, I mean, okay, in the Navy, in the defense world, they have very clear system engineers
Yeah.
and software developers. And I made it a mission to just obliterate that line. And that's why, yeah, I was like, I'm going to stick my nose into the system
Yeah.
engineering. Um, Clean code is a clean sign of a clear mind. Sloppy code, sloppy thinking. So kind of obvious again, but I always just, when I review code, that's one of the things I'll look at. Like if someone submits a merge request or a pull request or something, and I'm doing a code review, I just think like if you really understood the problem well, your code should also be almost a direct translation of your thoughts on it. So when your code isn't clear, I realized I could start probing and saying, ask questions about that. And usually I would find out they haven't really figured out like what's going on here. If I was like, this loop doesn't really make sense, can you explain it to me? Usually the answer is, I'm not sure, which is a
Right.
perfect opportunity for me to jump in, or a senior person to jump in and say, oh, let me help you, crystallize your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
And so what are the hallmarks for you? Without, I understand that the Uncle Bob book on clean code is this thick, but what are the hallmarks of
Oh,
clean
you know what? This
code
is an
for you?
easy one because
Yeah.
honestly, like it sounds silly, but good formatting, good
Yeah.
consistent formatting doesn't mean anything, but it means everything, because it tells me when someone doesn't indent their code properly, or has the curly braces inconsistent places. That's kind of what I think. That indicates to me you're not really precise about that stuff, so you're probably not really precise about what it's doing either. Um, and that has been a pretty good heuristic I found.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you can just eyeball it and see immediately, like, this doesn't smell right. You don't have to,
Yeah.
I don't have to, as a reviewer, you can tell in 5 seconds, this, yeah, I'm gonna have some comments.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that actually goes back to your uh talk about kind of feeling it, not
Yeah.
necessarily, right? Because we're talking about heuristics,
Hmm.
gut instincts, things like that.
It's
Um,
it's a struggle to, that's a struggle I've had as a senior guy trying to teach and mentor, is all the things that I realize are more intuition, and I don't know how to explain the intuitions I have. and that's a continual problem that I have. Actually, I'm curious if you have any insights on that. I know you were a teacher, right? Um,
In terms of how do you teach the intuition?
like if somebody has a math problem and you say, here's how you solve this problem, and they're like, how did you figure that out?
Right.
Because my honest answer would be, I didn't, you might explain, here's the 5 steps you should follow. And then, but you didn't really follow those steps. You kind of knew the answer, and you can work backwards to figure out. That's the struggle I've had.
Yeah. And that comes from practice. So I don't know, from practice and having seen the problem once before. So I don't know what the trick would be other than to practice, to teach practicing of problems, or suggest going on Leak Code once a day and doing solve a problem a day, and eventually you'll start to see those building blocks.
Gotcha. It's not necessarily a direct, here's what you do in this situation. It's more,
Yeah,
keep practicing in
keep
general.
practicing.
Gotcha.
Back
Okay.
to back to Gladwell, it's 10,000 hours,
Right.
right? So
The
here we go.
10,000
And
hours
so there are a
thing.
few more.
Yeah. There are a few more. Where was I? Avoid premature optimization, but don't neglect big O complexity. As I kind of alluded to a lot earlier, I am a big fan of like complexity analysis and doing that, thinking that, or like having that as a tool in your toolbox of
Yeah.
that you could do complexity analysis. But yeah, I remember that one of the when I worked on my web project at the beginning of my career, like one of my coworkers, um, our thing was too slow. And so they were like, oh, I'm going to optimize it. And so they took every for loop in JavaScript, every for loop that was in the code. And every time it said for I equals 0, I is less than array.length, they like cached array.length in a variable. And then,
Oh, that'll speed it up.
so, and I
Not
looked at that
that.
and I was like, no, 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 no. Like, oh, this is if you Google JavaScript optimization techniques, they'll throw out simple things like that. And I was like, no, but that's not at all helpful for many reasons, which is like, the big O stuff is where your big gains are.
That's
It's
where it is.
not
Yeah.
the tiny things like that.
Yeah.
And also, and then premature optimization, avoiding that is just all about, hey, if you really think performance is a problem, um, you need to wait until it's a problem. Don't just randomly speed things up and do clever algorithms for no reason. And then 2, profile your code, measure it, be systematic and kind of, scientific about it.
Right.
So, and it's a very good chance you're going to be surprised about what piece of code is the hotspot. Like, and I make this mistake all the time. I feel like I know what the right piece of code is where I need to fix it, but I'm wrong half the time,
Right.
It turns out, this loop over here I didn't even think about is executed a billion times.
Right.
And I'm like, whoops, okay. That's where the problem is. So yeah. Forget personal preferences. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. This is like a getting along with your coworkers thing, working in a code base that you didn't originate. I just think it's good manners to, hey, if you like 4 spaces and the code is that you're working in is 2 spaces, use 2 spaces.
Right.
It's like my pet peeve is I can't stand when I can open up a source file and I can spot, oh, coworker X,
Developer
that's
1,
their
developer
code
2. Yeah.
because of the way it's formatted.
Yeah. We
So
had this is a lesson that I learned about 10 15 years ago. But I came in hot shot, new programmer, new job, and I'm working on the code base. First time working in a pull requests type thing. You're not the only developer checking in the only file. And so I see this file. I redo the whole tabination because it was wrong. So I reformatted the file. And I sent that into my pull request, and the response I got was, don't reformat files. Don't do that. Don't redo the tabination. And it was not for me. it was for the person who has to read my code, instead of having the one line of code that I added,
Yep.
they had an entire, it was the whole file was green and the whole file was red. Did
Yeah.
you really rewrite this entire thing from scratch and complete? No, I just had one line of code. It's just, well, don't give me that pull request then, because I need to see what you've done, not what you've reformatted.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing a reformatting is okay, you're allowed to do reformatting, but only do reformatting in a
Right.
standalone reformatting pull request. And so just like you're saying here, across the board, there are engineers everywhere who eventually get this same lesson in a different way, right? So yeah, follow what the team is doing, because tab spaces 2, 4, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's just get the code out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an easy lesson to teach, and everybody does it.
Yeah.
So I always, there's like big lessons that are really hard to teach, and I was like, that one, everybody can fix that one. There, boom, you're a 1% better programmer right there.
That's right.
Easy.
That's right.
Here's a hard one. Concurrency is hard. Oh boy, is concurrency hard. And then I had, that's not even a philosophy thing. That's just a, hey, maybe if we can avoid if you can avoid concurrency, that's almost a better way than trying to make it work.
Right.
I like how, that's still something that computer science has not exactly figured out. It's like the best way to do this, because it's trade-offs. This is all about trade-offs. Concurrency gives you a lot of performance speed ups, and your cost is just, the complexity and the bug level just goes way up. Your ability to reason about stuff goes way down. If you're the kind of programmer and I think a lot of, that, like, the compiler can tell you syntax errors and stuff. It can't tell you, hey, you didn't lock on over here, you should synchronize or something. And that stuff will blow up in very mysterious ways. And that's like one of these, I feel like, as I said in the beginning, like learning assembly and C, and sort of like my education sort of building up like that, in going up, like, from C to Java, and then, like from low to high level. I think it helps learning, because you can see these more fundamental concepts and they apply everywhere. And then it's like, when I learned JavaScript, and they had this super weird idea of like, you only have one thread of execution, and
Right.
everything's asynchronous if you want to do concurrent stuff. It made sense to me, but I can just like, I feel so bad about people who start with JavaScript. That's so weird. It's such a bizarre way to do coding if you have no idea why it's doing it like that.
Yeah.
And that the alternative of having lots of threads is easier to think about, but then your program's going to have deadlocks and race conditions, and oh my god, it'd be a nightmare in a web browser to just deadlock.
Yeah.
So they're just like,
Yeah.
they're trying to do everybody a favor, but I don't know. So I'm like, that concurrency is hard. If I think a little plug, but that my favorite thing that I've done in the last couple of years has been learning Rust. I think that
Okay.
programming language is incredible. It's one of these things where everybody that worked on it just seems so smart, and just like they all seem like MIT wizards. Their ideas are just so elegant, and like, highly recommend it. It's a language that will teach you things about programming. I learned things that I didn't know, that no other language has these concepts. It's fascinating, and it'll make you a better programmer. It'll make everybody a better programmer, even if you don't work in Rust. So concurrency is something they have a really good answer for. And I can't even attempt to explain it, but if anybody's curious about concurrency, you look up what Rust does about it. It's fascinating.
Okay. Okay. That's a
Thread the
pretty
trade-off needle.
strong strong endorsement for Rust. How did you learn it?
So that's, I guess, actually, so you asked about like continual learning or I did learn that on the job, and I actually, that was when I made a deliberate effort. Well, we as a team sort of decided like, hey, we should play around with some other languages, like, so we're not just a homogenous Java stack, everything's in Java or whatever. So I was like, let's break off a chunk of our code and let's try to do it in Rust. And someone else tried to do it, the same thing in Go, just so we were like, let's just try out some of these languages for a few months. So I did the Rust side and I loved it. And yeah, so that was a employer endorsed, or maybe I should say I got away with it because them not being that technical, they didn't know what I was up to.
Yeah.
And
Your
and all my
business
coworkers
case
were
says
fine.
this is
They're not,
super important.
the guy
Signed
signing the,
programmer.
doing the budgeting didn't know what was up.
Yeah.
So we got away with it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So just yeah, try to. So user experience matters. This is interesting. I think everybody's always like, am I a back end, am I a front end programmer? And I think like, hey, for people who are back end people, you don't have to like love UX, but it should be something you think about.
Right.
Because it, like from the holistic point of view, it impacts everything. And if your app or whatever sucks to use it, it doesn't matter how great your database is,
Right.
Like, so I think like if you want to be, if you're, especially like the whole 10x engineer thing, you got to look at all the problems in the system. So like everything that you can influence, you should. And so you should influence UX. You should look into the people on your team. Like that's what I think about, all these different things that I would rather have said, these aren't in my sphere. This is not my job description. I think, to be a great engineer, you say, I'm going to make my job description to care about all this stuff. Yeah, you just have to do it. And then the last one, there's no substitute for good taste. I love, there was a talk by Linus Torvalds was explaining, he's like, he's the guy who made the Linux kernel. And, he gave a great talk, which is on YouTube, where he was explaining, he's like, there's just something about some people have good taste and others don't. And he gave a code example and he was like, I can explain to you all the things that are going on in this code and why it's a bad idea, but like fundamentally, we need people who have good taste. And it's like, it's a thing you can't teach. He might have said, these might be my words, but it's just something that people have. And so this is like this indefinable quality that I'm looking for in people I work with. Like, not just do you understand technical decisions and do you understand the system architecture? Can you diagram it? Like, if there are trade-offs, do you make them tastefully? Do you have this gut feeling about like, this is just elegant, I want to do the elegant thing? I don't know,
Yeah.
It's absolutely crucial, and can't explain it in any good way.
Right. Okay. It's just well, that was the line. The line was about feelings. So yeah, those are tougher to manage. Okay. Well, John, I've taken more of your time than you originally promised, but I hope you have enjoyed this.
Absolutely.
This has been real. I have enjoyed this. This has been really great for me too. And if anybody wants to track you down, do you have any Twitter or anywhere anybody could find you?
I'm just an old school guy. I probably, my email address is john@kugelman.name. That sounds weird. That's the best way to find me. .name. It's it's just my name. Yeah. And I'd love to, or find me on Stack Overflow.
Or on Stack Overflow.
Look for me out there. Yeah. Post a question. I will make sure to edit out all the nice things that you put in there.
Right. It better be a question. There should be no hi John in it at all.
Don't put hi John.
Yeah, that's it. Not allowed.
No.
All right.
No, thanks. This podcast is a great thing. It's just nice to be able to talk about this stuff. I'm glad you're doing it, and I hope I'm looking forward to listening to the many more hours of it that I have in front of me.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.
Well, in terms of getting it live, I'm just putting up, finishing up Clint Blackburn, who was another guy who just did it. So he'll be next week. You'll probably be the week after that. So you're probably 2 weeks out before you can see yourself.
All righty.
All right. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Take care.